everybody. Welcome to the 2019 Film Lecture. So we're going to start tonight by spending a few minutes remembering Dr. Bill Roll. That's why we're here. So I'll say a little bit about Bill Roll, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this year, Dr. Julie Mossbridge. So I was actually very fortunate to meet Dr. Roll on 2 occasions, and before I was applying here, I wrote to him to ask him if I should go for this job, and he thought that it would be a great fit and encouraged me to apply. So pretty much I'm here because of Dr. Roll. And yeah, so I'll say a little bit about him. Bill Roll was a prominent researcher in psychical research and academic parapsychology. Dr. Roll was born in Bremen in Germany in 1926 and spent most of his childhood in Denmark, and that was his mother's home country. Dr. Roll's interest in psychic phenomena began at 16 when he had an out-of-body experience. Bill went to Oxford University in the UK to study with H.H. Price and wrote his Master of Letters thesis on theory and experiment in psychical research. You don't have an MA at Oxford, it has to be a Master of Letters. He later completed his doctoral research at Lund University in Sweden, and he focused a lot of his work on survival hypothesis, so the idea that some aspects of human personality could survive after bodily death. He worked as part of J.B. Ryan's Duke Parapsychology Lab in Durham in North Carolina, and later began and directed his own foundation, the Psychical Research Foundation, the PRF. He came here and served as a professor in the 1980s, and that was initially funded by the PRF. And then he later taught as an adjunct professor in the Psych department until his retirement in 2008. He's particularly well known for his research on poltergeists, in particular the Seaford poltergeist case and the Columbus poltergeist case. He's written several books on this topic and over 100 scholarly articles. He passed away the second year that I was here, in 2012, and since that time we decided to honour his memory by holding an annual event in his name called the Bill Roll Lecture. And for that event we invite a prominent researcher in parapsychological research to come to us and give a lecture on a topic that is close to their own heart. And so this year, as I said before, we invite Dr. Julie Mossbridge. And so we're very grateful to her for flying over from California. Sorry. Change papers. Okay, so Dr. Mossbridge is a visiting scholar, I should say, in the psychology department at Northwestern University. And she's also a fellow at the Institute for Noetic Sciences. Her focus is on teaching and learning about love and about time. And some of our students got to hear about some of that this morning. She was the 2014 winner of the Charles Honorton Integrative Contributions Award from the Parapsychological Association. That is the professional organisation for parapsychological work in the world. Julia's PhD in Communication Sciences and Disorders is from Northwestern University. Her MA in Neuroscience is from the University of California at San Francisco. And she received her BA with highest honours in Neuroscience from Oberlin College. So we are so excited to hear from her today. Her talk is going to discuss the concept of the long body in the context of precognition. So I'm very excited to hear from her. So if I can invite you to come to the stage.
Let's see. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I met Christine in the back of a cab in Tucson at the Science of Consciousness conference and immediately became fast friends. So let me try this without the handheld mic and see how it is. Can you hear me? Okay. Is it okay not to use this mic? Great, because I'm already holding this mic. And then I also have to hold my slide clicker. So good. Okay, if I ever sort of dip my voice so you can't hear, then please tell me to pipe up, okay? Well, I'm super grateful to be here. I have been asked over the last year to give 3 talks in academic settings. And this is the first time in 12 years since I've been studying precognition that I've been asked to do so. So I've been asked to go to corporate settings like Google and places and talk about precognition. But the academic community has been relatively slow. And it means a lot to me because when I was looking for a tenure track position, I was told that my strategy should be to take everything that has to do with ESP and precognition off my resume, and then it was great. And these are people who were giving me this advice. They were wanting to be helpful because they were saying, look, you have a great resume. Just take those things off and you can get a job. And I was like, those are the things that are interesting that I would like to study for the rest of my life, so no thank you. So I left academia and I thought, well, maybe I'll just never go back. And now I'm starting to give talks to folks in academia, and it's delightful. It means a lot to me, and it especially means a lot to me with this lecture because Bill Roll, I was really stunned when I first read his paper, Psi and the Long Body. And at first I thought it explained everything about precognition, and tonight I'll tell you about how I disagree with my past self. I don't think it explains everything about precognition, but I do think it's a great springboard for trying to understand what's going on, and it brings up some beautiful ideas that I want to challenge and talk about. So that's why I'm here, and because of that cab ride with Christine. And I'm just so delighted with my visit. So I just wanted to thank, before I get on into my world of talking about this stuff, and I can go quickly and I can get a lot of information and try to communicate that, I want to make sure I'm very clear, and I say it has really been an honor today talking with students here and going to lunch with David Mitchell and going to the special collections and talking with Gordon and just all sorts of experiences with the people here. I'm really impressed. What a great place. So thank you. So let's get to the Bill Roll of it. In Psi and the Long Body, which is this paper that came out in 2018, which is why I was familiar with it. It was on the internet. He says, the human mind and the human body are a synthesis of many minds and many bodies. Some are our ancestors in the near or distant past. Others are living people, some close to us in place and time, others distant. In our daily lives, when we act as one single-minded body, the many voices are joined into one. It is the transpersonal core of personal existence. Cool, right? Definitely transpersonal, right? It includes this idea of our ancestors as well as anyone that we've really been connected to with meaning. And he named this the long body, but he didn't really name it the long body. Actually, the Iroquois Indians named it the long body, and he acknowledged that. And another researcher, Christopher Aanstoos, before him, had actually named it the long body. But he brought it into a scholarly discussion of Psi rather than an anecdotal discussion. And that's what he was doing in this paper. So I'm going to shorten the long body here to consistently maintained meaning relationships with objects and beings in your life. So what would that mean? Your cell phone right now, almost everyone has this consistently maintained relationship that's full of meaning with this object in your life, right? So that's part of, for sure, part of your long body. If you were an Iroquois Indian, it might be, maybe back 300 years, it might instead be your teepee, right? Or maybe the weapons that you use to hunt. But so our cell phone, we do all of that. We get protection, we hunt with it, right? It's all that. Relationships, people you meet, animals that you love. So what does this have to do with Psi? The idea of the paper is that information in your long body, whatever's in your long body, all these interactions and memories of experiences and stuff, I love that word. It's so non-technical. Everything that's in your long body can be accessed outside of space-time via Psi. Now, he does not use the term space-time, but the way he talks about it in his previous work as well as in this paper, it's clear that he means outside of space-time. You can access this. And the rules about what you're accessing have to do with this long body. So really, Roll's extension of the long body offers an explanation of why psi, or paranormal experience, I'm going to define some aspects of psi in a second in case you don't know what that is, of why psi links only a subset of space-time coordinates. So if you think about it scientifically, why do I not get information about what's going on with this music stand versus getting information about what's going on with my cell phone? Because I have a relationship with my cell phone over time that has meaning, and I do not, this is the first time I saw this music stand and it doesn't have a lot of meaning for me. Now later if I like bump into the music stand and it falls over, I may have a relationship in the future with that music stand, right? And then I would be wrong about what was in my long body. So this applies to, he talks in the paper about how this applies to psychokinesis, mentally moving objects. So you would move objects that have meaning to you, have a relationship to you. Clairvoyance, getting information from something in your long body. Telepathy, reading the minds of people who are in your long body. Okay, so it's a story about what are the rules that underlie your psi abilities. Okay? But what about precognition? So he mentions precognition in the paper, but he gets a little confused about it, in my opinion. And so let's talk briefly about what I mean by precognition first, so everyone's on the same page. So the way I define precognition is that you have conscious or unconscious accurate prediction of future events that are not already predictable by inference or by direct cause. So let me unpack that for you. If I have a dream that I eat a turkey sandwich, and the next day I go, oh, I had that great dream about the turkey sandwich. I'm hungry. I think I'm going to make a turkey sandwich. That's a direct cause. You're directly lining up your experience of that next day with your dream. That does not count as precognition because you were in charge of making the turkey sandwich and you got the idea from your dream, okay? It doesn't mean it can't be precognition, but it doesn't count as precognition in this context. Inference is even unconscious inference. Like it turns out that every Thursday my aunt calls me, but I didn't realize that for 3 months. And so then on Thursdays I'd be like, I bet she'll call today. And then she would call and I'd say, oh, precognition. Well, no, actually it turns out she has a pattern that I haven't really picked up on, right? So inference and direct cause, they exist in the context of precognition, but to decide that something's actually scientifically precognitive, those can't be the good explanations for what's going on. So what did Bill Roll say about precognition? Well, in 1961, I just discovered today from my trip to the special collections, he wrote a paper called The Problem of Precognition. I was looking for such a paper because based on his discussion of precognition in the long body paper, it's clear he has a little problem with precognition. So here he actually wrote a paper called The Problem with Precognition. He did not like it so much. So when he talked about, in this paper in 1961, he thought, look, there's a problem with this violation of space-time situation with precognition. So I'm going to say that precognition is psychokinesis. So he gave an example of a card guessing task where the person was able to guess the next random card. And he said they probably had psychokinesis that created, that put in the mind of the person who was pulling the cards what the next card should be. So it was a real problem with the idea of receiving information from the future. Instead, it was more like that it was a forced, it was an out, it wasn't an input, it was an output. And that made him feel better, even though they're both weird, right? So it's just interesting. And then later, we're going to skip to 2008, he gets it that there's evidence for precognition, and he still thinks it's someone experiencing their future self. So again, the future self is sort of pushing the information back. But he kind of progresses a little and he says, look, maybe it's like a giant. So by seeing things further in space, the giant can see things coming down the road that are still in the future for a dwarf, right? And then it says, look, psychics habitually experience places in the present that are in the past or future for the rest of us. They are our giants. So I have several problems with this. One is the idea that everyone's not psychic. It's psychics who are these giants. Another problem is that experience places in the present. So he habitually seems to turn, and throughout the paper there's multiple examples, he habitually seems to turn time into space. So he doesn't think about time as time, he thinks about it as space. which can be a problem because his intuitions about it then are these things like psychics are giants and they could see things down the road. The problem I have with that is that it doesn't match the data. So you would expect if people who are psychic are giants and can see things down the road, not that they're literal giants, but they're in some sense able to see things coming down the road, they're able to see their own future experience. There's a certain number of things you would expect, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what data fit that idea and what data don't. What data don't. So here's essentially the way I see his long body precognition hypothesis. Is that, look, precognition is present moment awareness of one's own future experience of an event. So he's come a long way from like it's someone controlling what's happening to them and being able to predict it because they're controlling it. But he's still saying that I'm basically going to experience my future experience of the event and that's how I get the information. And it sounds reasonable. And it sounded reasonable to me for about 10 years until I trained myself to be consciously precognitive. Side story, I had a friend who was a college professor who studied sex workers. And in order to study sex workers, she became a sex worker for a period of time. Privately, she didn't tell anyone. But she wanted to get firsthand information about what it was like to be a sex worker because that's what she was studying. And I so shamed her. I was like, you can't get in the mix with the subjects that you're studying. It's going to mess up your research. I wasn't worried about the sex worker part. I was worried about, whatever. But I was worried about poisoning her research by getting too involved with this. So then I totally violated my own rule and decided to train myself in conscious precognition. And I'm really glad I did because now I know about my own phenomenal experience of precognition and I can talk about that as well as laboratory studies. So let's talk about this. So precognition is not one thing. So there's an array of different precognitive types of experiences. So here's a little matrix I made. At the bottom we have not being conscious of the content of the precognition. So that on the top we have being conscious of the content of the precognition. Let me give you an example of not being conscious is something like compulsive PAA. That's a name I made up for precognition to talk to mainstream audiences. Predictive anticipatory activity. It's fancy enough that you don't know that it's parapsychology. So compulsive PAA or compulsive precognition is when I don't know, I just had to go in the baby's room and I just had no idea what was going on, but the baby said stop breathing. And I'm grateful I did and I don't know how that happened. That's compulsive precognition, right? So you're not conscious of the content. You're not thinking, I'm going to go in the baby's room and I'm going to find that the baby has stopped breathing. You're not thinking that. You're thinking of an action, okay? Example of being conscious of the content is either dream precognition or conscious controlled precognition, where you literally are consciously aware of the precognition. You either have a dream about it and you can write it down afterwards, or you do what I call controlled precognition, which you're conscious of and you write down the information. On the right-hand side, you have kinds of precognition that have a long lead time. So for instance, a dream, a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week can pass, sometimes months or years, before the event actually comes to fruition. Conscious controlled precognition could be years, right? So there in the corner, on the left we have short lead time, and the two I haven't talked about yet, and which I'll talk about in depth next, are physiological precognition and behavioral precognition. So those are both unconscious and short lead time, half a second to seconds between the precognition and the event. And so I'm going to explain that in more detail. First I'll talk about these all, which are these unconscious short lead time versions, and we'll see how those types of precognitions either do or don't match with Bill Roll's ideas. And then later I'll talk about, oh, are we stopping? Are we not responding? Yeah, we're not responding. I think the battery just died. Who wants to be my slide forwarder person? Would you be willing? Thank you. Now I only have to hold one thing. How am I doing on volume? Good? Great. Okay. Then I'll talk about the conscious waking precognition. So I'm going to the two extremes, and we're going to see how the extremes fit in here. Okay? All right, great. So next slide. Thanks. So here's a protocol to examine unconscious short lead time physiological precognition. so that you really understand this. The way it works in the lab is you've got a period of time when you have a person sitting in front of a computer screen and there's nothing going on for the person. What you're doing is, as a scientist, you're measuring their physiology. So their heartbeat, their oxygenation of their blood maybe you're looking at their EEG, maybe you're measuring skin conductance. So you might be measuring any number of measures that you could physiologically through the whole experiment. And the next thing that happens is there's an event. It's randomly selected to either be a neutral event, usually, or an emotional event. So for example, you win a prize, you don't win a prize. Or there's a picture of a plane crash versus a picture of a pair of shoes, right? You don't know what that event is going to be, it's random. And then there's a period of no stimulus. So super simple experiment to set up. You record physiologically through it, and then if you go to the next slide, the way you analyze it is you've got your physiological traces that precede the neutral events, which are in the green up there, and your physiological traces that come before the emotional events, and those are in the red, and the difference is that effect. And this has been done over and over and over again with a bunch of different kinds of random number generators and a bunch of different physiological systems. And the deal is our bodies, so everyone in this room, if we took everyone in this room and we averaged all our responses, it's very, very likely that we would show this effect. Even though people would largely claim not to be aware of what the future picture is going to be on the screen, right? This is why precognition is difficult for people to grasp, because you didn't know I was going to do this, right? You didn't know that consciously. But these kinds of experiments suggest that some part of you knew that, and you can measure that part. And so if you go to the next slide, what I did was work with Jessica Utz from UC Irvine and Patrizio Trasoldi from University of Padova in Italy, and we did a meta-analysis of 26 experiments from 1978 to 2010, where we examined this physiological prediction of the future events that should not be predictable. And we found wildly significant results. Like you would not bet against this effect. Go ahead and switch the. And I used to show a graph and then explain the graph here, but then I figured out I'm showing too many graphs and people get bored. So I am instead showing the code from the matrix. And if you're nerdy, you can look at the equations or the statistics, right? So basically, it's a big effect. It's very unlikely to be an effect that's happening by chance. And so far as I know, no one's been able to give any of us as authors, and certainly not me, an explanation of why this would happen other than that your body is predicting the future. So let me just break it down a little bit more for you. Let's in the linear temporal model of space-time events. In other words, in the traditional way that we talk about time, I'm going to break it down for you. Okay? I'm not saying that's an explanation for what's happening. I'm saying it's usually easy to explain first this way, because this is how we're taught to think about time. So S for space is a dot, because in the entire experiment, you're basically in the same place. Okay, so S, your spatial coordinates are not changing. The participant is right in that location. T for time is going from the top to the bottom. So you go from no stimulus, an unconscious body response to a future stimulus, to a random number generator choosing the future stimulus, to your conscious awareness or your experience of the stimulus, because now it's been chosen and shown to you, so now you have conscious awareness, to unconscious body response to the past stimulus. Like we know that you respond to a picture of a plane crash afterwards differently than you respond to a pair of shoes. What's new here is you're doing it beforehand too, right? So that's the breakdown in space-time. So let's go one more slide here. So notice this. What we're talking about is some kind of communication between that periwinkle one and that yellow one. Sometimes some kind of communication between your conscious awareness of the image and your unconscious body response in the past, right? That seems to be what we're talking about. Does that make sense? So go to the next one. The question is, where and when in space-time does that arrow exist? Well, in the way we think about space-time right now, it doesn't exist in space-time. And why is that? It's not because time can't go forward and backwards. Most physical equations that we know are reversible in time. So that's not why. It's not even because physicists say that time doesn't go backwards. Now they're starting to say, yeah, really, we don't understand time, and our individual experience of time is really what we're trying to explain here, not physics. Why it's not in space-time is the reason I bolded that statement of conscious awareness experience of the stimulus, is because that is not in space-time. So this is the piece that I think is really important and never said in Bill Roll's work, and what I want to extend it by saying is that every time you have a conscious experience, that experience is not in space-time. By which I mean, think of the color red. Point to the location in space where that thought is. I know where your body is, where you're thinking of the color red. I can point out each of your bodies when you're thinking of the color red. But there is no location for that thought in space. It is in time. It's in time. It's not in space. It's in that moment you're thinking of the color red. That's time. But there's no location for that thought. And we're so trained to believe there's a location for everything because we live in this materialist world, right? Even our attention is drawn by the cell phone, right, to that location. It's very location-based. But there's no location for mental activity. There's a brain, and that influences mental activity and is influenced by, apparently, mental activity. But you think of anything, and there's no place to point to where that thing is. So conscious experience can never be in space-time. I mean, I'm saying this as if it's a foregone conclusion. I could spend way too much time trying to defend that idea, but just intuitively, it's very, very, very hard to point to a location for a thought. And we have to kind of admit that to ourselves, I think. So thoughts exist in time, it seems, but not in space. It seems, just it seems. Like, let's just go with it seems. Okay, next slide. So let's go back to the hypothesis. Precognition is present moment awareness, so that's conscious experience, of one's own future experience of an event. So both of those experiences can't be happening in space-time because they're conscious experiences, right? So let's see if that's even true here. Let's see what the next slide says. This is an example of an experiment I did where folks came in and they saw 4 pictures. None of them were emotional. They were just boring, kind of. But their job was to pick. I said to them, look, I'm a crazy person, and I want you to pick which of these 4 images a random number generator is going to select and show to you. And they'd say, but that's impossible. And I'd say, totally, do it anyway, because you have to get credit for Psych 101. And they did. And as they were doing it, I was recording their skin conductance. So if you go to the next slide. So by the way, this is the one that was the target on that trial, by the way, in case you wanted to know. Next one. And I recorded their skin conductance, and I want to show you here just the very first trial of 40 trials. And the reason I'm showing you the skin conductance on the very first trial is the effect that I'm going to show you is a big effect. And if it wasn't the first trial, you might think it was the previous trial that was producing the effect. And I don't want you to think that, so we're going with trial number 1. Okay? Right in the middle of the screen is where I have the left side blocked off so that you can see that later. Right in the middle of the screen is where I tell them, here's the target. I show them the target. So they know whether they were correct or incorrect right at that moment, at 0 seconds. This is their skin conductance in microsiemens 10 seconds after they're shown whether they're correct or incorrect. Black is correct, red is incorrect, top is women, bottom is men. Women, not much of an arousal. There's a skin conductance, so it's supposed to measure arousal. Not much of an arousal difference between being correct and incorrect. Men, big difference. Also notice the y-axis for the men is actually twice that of the women. I had to shrink it because they had such a big effect for being right. So, which we laugh at, but women love to be right too. But in this particular case, I mean, it's actually very interesting. Gambling addicts are twice as likely to be men as compared to women. And I think if the first time you gambled, you had that kind of a response and you were right, like that's a big arousal response. That's interesting. Okay, so let's look what happened before the random number generator decided what the image was going to be. So for women, you see not much difference. Actually, less arousal before they're going to be correct than correct, but that's not significant. For men, you see a big difference, and that's the interaction's significant and the effect itself before the the time of finding out about correctness versus incorrect is also significant. So this really seems to support Bill Roll's idea of you're experiencing your future. It may not be conscious, but your body at least is experiencing your future experience, right? There's almost like a mirror in time there at 0, where the women are starting to look like themselves. There's not much difference. Men are very much of a difference. Those are their different experiences, and it's matching across time. So that actually seems to support the idea. Let's go to the next slide. So I was fascinated by this, and I decided I'm all into using the whole world as a laboratory. So it's the long laboratory. And so I made an app with a coder that registered heart activity. So you put your finger, on the webcam, and it gets your heart activity. Okay, and it was just a one trial situation, because I realized it was really useful to just have one trial effects, because people don't worry about what happened before that. Nothing happened before that. So it was just a simple game. There's 4 doors. And the question is, which door is going to give you a $2 bonus? And I just put it loose on mTurk, which is a platform for getting a bunch of people to do things, and told them I'd pay them $2 to do the thing, and there was a 50% chance they might win another $2. And they were excited about that. So people downloaded the app. And if you go to the next slide, this is what their data looked like. So these are single trials. And you have the same situation. I'm just going to tell you the upshot because it's hard to see, but I hopefully will be able to explain it to you. This is a $2 prize. So you have low arousal at the top, high arousal at the bottom. So this is heart rate, not skin conductance. So it's the reason it's plotted that way is you have a longer time in between the beats at the top and a shorter time in between the beats at the bottom. And before, the dotted lines are 0. So that's when they find out whether they won or lost. And the 10 seconds before are to the left, and the 10 seconds after are to the right. And for women, you have this red line below the black before, and for men, you have the red line above the black. Go ahead and go to the next slide. You actually have exactly the same effect as in the laboratory with skin conductance. So before they find out whether they won or lost, there's very little difference for women, although they are reversed than they are afterwards. For men, there's a significant difference in the same direction as afterwards, and there's a gender interaction. These are totally different people, totally different experiment, same effect. So again, it really supports this idea that they're experiencing their future experience. They're experiencing their future change in physiology. This is why the first time when I read Roll's paper, I was like, yeah, he nailed it. That's exactly what's happening. So I'll just tell you about the demise of that idea. So go ahead. We have one more example of this. This is a forward priming experiment turned into a retroactive priming experiment. So this is a standard. I'm first going to talk about the standard psychology experiment. Forward priming, go for it, has been done for decades. You see a word like dangerous, okay? And then you see a picture like this little girl eating an ice cream cone. And there's a mismatch between the word you just saw and the picture, right? So go to the next slide. So your job is to respond quickly. Was that a positive or negative picture? Well, it turns out it takes longer for you to respond if there's a mismatch between that word you just saw and the picture, because your brain's going, okay, yeah, it was positive, but like dangerous, right? It's confused, right? So go ahead and show. So the expected forward priming result is this: when the word matches the picture that came before, when the word that came before the picture matches the picture, you have a faster response, which is lower on this graph, and when it doesn't match, you have a slower response. So that's what's expected in the forward direction, and you can do that experiment till the cows come home, and you're going to get that. So let's do the next deal. This is retroactive priming. Daryl Bem at Cornell University invented this version of this experiment. And go ahead. And so the way that works is you see the picture first, then you're asked to respond. Was that a positive or negative picture? This should be much easier because you didn't see a word that's going to conflict with that picture sometimes. But if you go to the next one, then you see the word after you've responded. And then go to the next. When you analyze the data, this is what it looks like. Same. So the future word is influencing your response. So it's another example that's outside of physiology, but it's still unconscious. It's still fast time frame. You still don't know what you're doing. You're just pressing buttons, and you're told to just basically ignore that future word, because what does that have to do with anything? You're responding to the picture. But you're not ignoring the future word. It's getting in there, and it's changing your response rate. By the way, I just contracted with them to analyze the next set of data from a group of people, and it looks like the effects are very similar. So this seems to keep going periodically. So again, go ahead, sorry. So just in case this is an advertisement for their meta-analysis, in case you're interested in that kind of work, they did a meta-analysis of these kind of non-physiological behavioral studies where people just didn't know, but they were responding to the future event. Okay, so then one last thing before we get into the conscious stuff is this is a bridge to the conscious kind of long-term precognition. This is conscious short-term precognition. So I worked and created this game called Psi3, which you can get on the App Store. We don't have it for Android yet. And Psi3 has 3 games to it. One is a replication of the BEM experiment you just saw. One is this experiment, which is a precognition experiment using your conscious ability to precognize. So you see that screen on the left that has like a spacescape? Your job is to figure out where, do you see that outline of a little bird? Your job is to figure out where those little characters will show up in the future. And they don't show up. In fact, the random number generator doesn't choose their location until after you've chosen a place on the screen by pressing on it. Okay, so it's really about precognizing or using conscious precognition to try to figure out what's going to happen next. And there's one of the biggest results here is there's a huge amount of bias in terms of where people touch. People do not want to touch the upper left hand. They sort of don't want to touch the lower left hand. They really want to touch the upper right hand part of the screen. And they sort of want to touch the lower right hand part of the screen. So if you don't know that, this is just a lesson to those who are thinking of research methods. If you don't understand the bias in the responses and you're doing a study where there's like 30,000 different responses because it's on the internet, basically all you're going to see is the bias. So you first have to look for the bias because assume there's bias. And then what above the bias? What's different beyond the bias is the question you need to ask. And so what's different beyond the bias is only in the lower right quadrant. Is there any kind of precognitive effect? Only in the lower right quadrant are people pressing more often on the bottom, significantly more often on the bottom than they are on the top. When the master or when the character comes up in the lower right quadrant, for some reason, they're attracted to that and they're predicting it. I don't know why, except most people are right-handed and the bottom is closer to them. But that may be, I haven't tested that. But that's where you see the psi. So a person's experience doing precognition with this task is not going to be, wow, I'm nailing it, because they're going to be pressing all over the place and mostly in the upper right quadrant. Periodically, they'll press in the lower right quadrant and at a rate above chance, but barely, they'll be getting it correct. So they're not going to be conscious of their own precognition because of this bias, right? So it's not a future experience that they're precognizing because they're not even having the experience. So let's look at what we've learned. Precognition is present moment awareness of one's own future experience of an event, though for brief unconscious tasks, you may not be conscious of either the present moment or the future experience. And if you're not conscious of the present moment or the future experience, that could be happening in space-time, right? Because we don't know where unconscious lives. Maybe it lives in space-time, maybe it doesn't. And we know that the conscious experience, if we're going with this assumption, can't happen in space-time. It seems to happen in time. So let's keep going. Okay, so we've been talking about this stuff, short lead time, not conscious of content. Let's go to the fun stuff that people love to talk about, which is the stuff that's people actually have conscious experiences of, conscious waking PAA, or conscious waking precognition, which has a time frame of seconds to years. Okay, thanks. So the question is the hypothesis also supported, or at least partially supported, by conscious longer lead time precognition? So let's look at that. So this is funding in thousands of dollars for a largely precognitive government remote viewing training and testing program. So these are, I think, 11 or so agencies, including the DIA, the US Marine Corps, MIA, CIA, and the thousands of dollars they spent between, I think, something like 1973 and 1995 on a precognitive remote viewing program. So briefly, remote viewing is consciously using your mind, putting your mind in a place where you can receive information about whatever the target is. So it's whatever the target is. So it could be used for intelligence. It's a great way not to have spies killed if you can just leave them in a room and have them go places with their minds, right? Or get information with their minds. So this was much explored. And the reason I'm putting it up here is because it's an excellent example of controlled precognition or conscious precognition with a long time delay, which I just call controlled precognition. So if you go to the next slide, the thing is, conscious precognition seems to work without feedback. And the reason I'm putting these two pictures up there is because I had heard, the whole reason I started training myself in conscious controlled precognition is because I had heard from the military group that they didn't need feedback. And that flew in the face of this idea that you're basically sending information back to yourself in time, because they didn't get the feedback. And I thought that was nuts, and I wanted to train myself and see if I needed feedback. So I trained myself, I was decent at it, and I started working with this FBI and CIS guy. And he would ask me he would give me an 8-digit number called a tag. See that number on the right-hand side up there? That's a 6-digit number, but anyway, actually one equals the other, but anyway. It's called a tag, it's like an address in space-time, or outside of space-time, we don't know, right? It's an address of the target or the objective. And he would give me the 8-digit number. I didn't know what the objective was, but my job was to put myself in that place where I could receive information about the objective, scan it, and send it back to him. And the reason I put these two, this is my work. The reason I put these two here, oh no, that's a bummer. The reason I put these two here is because all I got was a text from the, a text from the officer saying, "Great work, that was really helpful." So he can't tell me exactly what's going on with their investigation. Like, I'm not allowed to get information about that through some kind of telephone means. But for these, he wrote, "That was great, thanks." One of them he wrote, "It was scary how close that was to what I needed to know." And I was like, why was that scary? We do this all the time, why are you scared? So that was interesting, but so you can see on the left, you know, I'm just drawing a sketch of someone who seems a woman, she's alone, her left half is deformed, I can't get her skin color. It seems like she might be anorexic. She's really smart, she's a powerful speaker, and she's very influential. And then I go on in other pages to talk about her psychological processes. That was the part that was helpful. But this part allows him to see that I have actually gotten to the target correctly, because that's the physical description, right? And on the right-hand side, you have, I say this guy again, and I just talk about his fears. This is an example of looking at someone's psyche. His fears, his hopes, his secrets, etc., actions in the future. He wants to blow up a school. He's technical, he wants to explode a school or whatever. That was super helpful. So that's all the feedback I got. I'll never know more about these people, who they were, what the situation was, except that they were helpful and they were on target. But I was able to give them very many details that matched, apparently, what he was experiencing. So, okay, so now I'm changing my mind about precognition. So this is not supported by anecdotal, I should just say, by anecdotal evidence, I should have said, does not support this, but let's see about the long laboratory. Let's look in the laboratory. So what I did was created a website called, you can switch it, sorry, the Premonition Code. And because I wrote a book with Teresa Chung called The Premonition Code about precognition, and especially about conscious controlled precognition. And I gave people sort of a playground where they could try this and learn this and actually go in depth with exactly this kind of procedure, except using pictures. So I'll show you how it works. There's 6 steps, and I don't need to go into that now, but basically you prepare in multiple ways. The whole process takes about half an hour. So this is a long lead time. Go ahead to the next. By the time you get to the part where you're actually having to choose between 2 different targets based on your data, it's been about 25 minutes, let's say. And so these are 2 graphs. The data are broken down into 8 different categories, you know, vegetation, subjects that are sentient, electricity, fire, water. And you have to choose, do your data most resemble the one on the left or the one on the right, which is just words or symbols or ideas. So just in this room right now, who feels like the slide I'm about to show you is going to be of space, sky, human-made structures, hills, mountains, electricity, fire, water, animals, and who thinks it's going to be a words, symbols, or ideas target? So let's first, so we're going to go on the left. A, raise your hand if you think it's going to be A. Cool, and raise your hand if you think it's going to be B. So we have multiple agreement. Have you been to this website? It's largely not words, symbols, ideas, but you think it's going to be words, symbols, ideas. Okay, go for it. Well, so it is. It's this quote, life need not be easy, provided only that it is not empty. So that's the target. So this website has word targets because there are certain people who are decent at actually figuring out what the words are that are going to be shown to them in the future, and they're few and far between, but I want to find them. So anyway, I also have a thing on the bottom that says, remember to send loving feelings back to yourself while you were working, which is a hard sentence to write because of the tenses, but it's really important if you're training yourself on this kind of task to love yourself as you're doing it and send love from the future. And the reason I say it's really important is not just because I've found it important and other people have found it important. It's because recently, I'm not going to show you the data right now because there's too much other stuff to talk about, but I recently did a study that showed that people's experiences of feelings of unconditional love actually correlates with their ability to do this. So really, love, there's something about love here. So go for the next one. So what do we find from the data? If you look at 3,700 total sessions, and so what we know for sure is that some people are good and some people aren't, but like that's boring. We already know that from historical stuff. What we learned here is that the pictures that were more interesting, in other words, if I gave to a group of 800 judges who didn't know what the experiment was, pairs of each of the worst, the pictures that people performed worse on, and the pictures that people performed best on, and I asked them to rate their interestingness. And the judges rated the ones that people performed best on as significantly more interesting than the ones that people performed worst on. Well, that correlates with William Roll's idea of meaning. That what's important, as long as you decide that interestingness and meaning relate. So this is just, by the way, the reason there's 4 sets of 2 bars is because I divided the data into 4 different, just in case any person asked a particular question, I have another bar to answer it. So it doesn't matter how you slice the data, you get the same effect is the point of that. Go for it. So what I want to do here is take you through asking the question, just looking at just a couple slides from 2 sample sessions about a target that was for a word, symbol, idea, and about how, ask yourself whether this looks most like someone's inside an experience or whether they're looking at the experience in the future, like when they would see the target. Just ask yourself that. I think it looks one way for sure, but you might have a different opinion. So, okay, so there's 2 targets. There's target 1 and target 2. These are at 2 different times. This one's more recent, but they're both probably a couple months ago. This is just me using the website for my own training, because I like to keep in shape, right? So on the left, I have what's called an advanced perceptual, which is something that comes to you during meditation. And the advanced perceptual is, this is us, and I receive a gift. Sometimes I call it a gift of an image, and it's me and my future self in a circle. So I feel like I'm holding hands with my future self. And on the right-hand side, I feel like I'm getting golden light from above. Okay, so that's my experience before I start my process. Next slide. Then I do a first, I want to tell you right now what the targets are so you can have a sense of what the targets are. The target they're both time targets. So in this data set, of course, because I'm interested in time and time travel, I put 2 targets that are graphics of time schematics. So past, present, and future on the right, time travel, causal chains on the left. You don't need to understand these, except, and I'm not sure anyone does, but just to know that these are sort of 2 time travel targets. Okay, next. And so we do these things called scans, where you basically scan, do a first pass of what is the information I'm getting, what's the visual, what are the adjectives that describe this. And the first target on the left, it's words, ideas, it's inspirational, devotional. I merge with the element. So that's one of the things that, word on the street is that the military, when they do this now, that they have fairly skilled viewers, that they're doing a lot of merging. And in their body, they sense the information. Merging with the element, what can you show me about yourself? I get play, play, play. I get a bucket, sandy beach, and I see almost like an envelope or something with that one. For the one on the right, I have a feeling of an Irish dancer. Upper part is staying still, but the bottom is moving, right? There's movement from the base. Now, do either of these really look like those two pictures? No. They sort of, I mean, you could imagine. But if you go to the targets again, you'll see on the left-hand side, okay, you could see that as an envelope. But what does that have to do with a sandy beach or a bucket? I don't know. It feels like play. It feels like play to me. On the right-hand side, you got the dancing, the movement at the base, right? There's movement at the base and not there, right? So that makes sense. But neither of those is a sketch of these. Neither of them says past, present, or future, or causal chain or anything. But they're about this experience, right? There's something about the experience of moving at the base that matches this. And the target could be anything, right? Like recently I had a target that was an alligator. My scans were very different, although it was so recent that I don't have them. But anyway, the picture, there's more than 600 pictures, so you don't know what the picture's gonna be. So let's go to the next. So my experience is that trained controlled precognition can't just be this, I'm going to sense the future experience of the target. It can't. Because when you're doing it, you're inside the target. It's not your future experience. It's the target coming to you and you experiencing what it's like to be that target. For instance, once my target was a dog. The very first dog I ever had as a target. And remember, you don't know what the target is, right, when you're doing this. When my very first dog, I had the experience of there's some kind of intelligent, like guardian-like being. And it's amazing. I love this being. I love this being. It's like wants to help people. It's full of unconditional love. What is this? I was so excited to get to the target and then to see a dog. I was so thrilled it was a dog. I love dogs. And I called my friend who has done 30 years of controlled precognition. I'm like, have you ever looked at a dog? And he's like, yes, they're like guardians of humanity and they're full of all this amazing intelligence. And we just talked about dogs because once you're inside, once you have the experience of being inside something when you're consciously not aware of what that thing is, you can learn something about it that you can't learn when you already consciously know what the thing is. So the reason I showed the time travel stuff is I learned stuff about how time travel or how this kind of precognition might work from the information that I got before I knew what the target was consciously. It's a super amazing experience. I cannot tell you how awesome it is. Okay, so train control precognition, no problem. Can't only be that. Yeah, it was well done. Or maybe it was PK. I don't think it could only be this because no feedback is required, and at least for people who do it, there's an experience of being inside the event. You're not experiencing your future self. You're literally inside an event. So let's look at what that could be like. Let's develop a model of that. And in case you're worried about time, we're almost done here, and there'll be time for questions. So go to the next slide. Can we expand the long body into nonlinear time to explain conscious long lead time psi experience? In other words, precognition or controlled precognition. What if we imagine every event in time as a marble? Okay? So go ahead and go to the next slide. And if we look at the event from the outside, look at the marble from the outside, our knowledge about the event depends on where and when the marble is shown to us. For instance, in this case, on the outside we can see that bubble because it's facing us. And we can see the dirt because in this particular spot in space-time, the marble is on dirt, right? This is Roll's long body view. The giant sees the event from the outside. Oh, that's my future experience. I see it from the outside. Okay, let's go to the next one. But now look at the event from the inside of the marble. So our knowledge of the event is independent of space and time, by which I mean you can't see the dirt. You can't see anything outside the marble. What you can experience is what it's like to be in that marble. And that's independent of space and time. It's what it feels like to be inside an event. And I'm talking about events rather than places on purpose because this is happening in time. It's not happening in space because it's your conscious experience. So go to the next one. So the outside knowledge on the top, it informs the cognitive meaning, the meaning that you're intellectually thinking about or knowing. The inside knowledge informs, Bill Roll likes to talk about the conative meaning, which is a really frustrating word because I had no idea what it meant and I Googled it and I'm like, I still don't know what it means. But it's supposed to mean like a striving or action-oriented or feeling meaning. like a feeling meaning. So I'm going to say that the inside knowledge informs the conative meaning, or conative maybe, I don't know. Next, we access the outside future, in other words, the thing that appears from the outside, to get the association of the tag, which is that 8-digit number I mentioned, and the event. So we have to go in the future to get the relationship between the tag, that 8-digit number, and the target. Anyone who's trained in this has to do that, because otherwise you don't know what you're looking for. So you have to do that. That's not a conscious experience. And then you trace the tag unconsciously to a conscious experience of the event from the inside. So the event could be in the past, it could be in the future, it could be about you, it could not be about you, it could be about an idea, it could be about a frog. You don't know, you go there, you figure out what it's like to be that inside that thing or person or experience or event. So a linear temporal model of space-time events in a controlled precognition experiment is this. You meditate, you're always sitting in the same space, you meditate over time, you have physical preparation, you set your intentions, you write down the tag, that number, that's like an address in space-time. You write down your experience of the target, that's when you're getting this information. Then a random number generator selects the target, and then you have your conscious awareness experience of the target. Oh, it turns out to be a quote, or oh, it turns out to be an alligator or a dog or whatever it is, right? So let's go to the next one. So this arrow from conscious awareness and experience of your target and your conscious experience of writing down the target is not in space-time, like we talked about before, right? So where is it? So what does it look like? Let's extend this long body. It looks more like this. By which I mean, this is a nonlinear model of non-space-time events in a controlled precognition experiment. There's time in the sense that each one happens, so there must be happening in a time, and they're separate events, which means they have to be separated by time. But they're all connected and talking to each other. So it's the long body in time. Does that make sense? These arrows are going to each of these events in time. So it's like this excellent woodcut that everyone likes to show when they're talking about spooky things. It's this feeling that humanity has always had. It's like, I want to get outside. I want to get outside of space-time. I want to see what's out there. And the next slide, I think, is more like how we think about it, which is this model of each of us is a separate. This is a dog toy, right? And they have these separate little spikes on it. Each of us is a separate little spike. And the way that we experience the world is, imagine you're one of those spikes and you're rolling around and you feel like the piano and the floor and my nose or whatever it is, right? That's how you're getting the sensory information. And so if you try to figure out precognition this way, it's very hard. Because how are you going to figure out the future of your experience? All you have is your experience of that present moment consciously, right? But if you turn this inside out and realize that all of these little spikes are connected in the middle, there's no problem with precognition or frankly any other psi. Because it's not happening in this outside area, which is space-time. It's happening in there, which is not in space-time and is totally connected. Okay, so it's like the long body becomes the tiny little ball body that has the inside squishy part, right? I don't know if you're getting this, but I love this metaphor. So maybe people will ask questions about this and I can clarify it further, go for it. So the long body consistently maintains meaning relationships with objects and being in your life. Information in your long body can be accessed outside of space-time non-locally via psi. That was the original sort of William Roll idea. And the way I'm wanting to shift it is, here's the even more extended long body. Relationships with meaningful events in the past and future that may be maintained and unconsciously accessed both inside space-time, which would be perception, and outside of space-time, which would be psi. Go for it. But can only consciously be experienced outside of space-time from within each event. So that little purple ball is like the marble being inside the marble, outside of space-time. All right, so this is, I know this is a lot, and there's a lot going on here, but that's kind of the extended model. Next. So this is an advertising slide. If you're interested in this stuff or just want me to slow down and cover one topic, pick one of these books. So the Premonition Code, which can take you through all the steps of controlled precognition. The Calling, which is a procedure for actually applying precognition to get information from your future self to call you into the world and bring your gifts to the world. And Transcendent Mind, which is a more scholarly work with Imatz Barus, published by APA Books, about the science of consciousness. Mossbridge Institute is one of my organizations that I created because I'm not in academia, to have a salary so people make contracts with me to do things. Also, I'm starting a new controlled precognition class online if you're interested. That's the address if you want to learn this stuff. I teach with John Vivanco, who worked for years with all sorts of government agencies. He's really good, and he's really an amazing Buddhist meditator who understands how to travel in time, apparently. And then next slide. I'm starting a nonprofit that you may or may not be interested in called the Institute for Love and Time, TILT. And there's the information, there's a password because it's just a very new organization. So I'm not letting everyone get in, but if you want to get in, that's the information. It's about time travel and unconditional love. And the last slide, I just want to thank everyone here for your beautiful support and love. And Christine and Gordon and David and Tobin, as well as scientists who have informed my ideas like Dean Radin, Stephen Baumgart, Daniel Sheehan, Ruth Kastner, and Brian Josephson, among many others. And also these funding and scholarly organizations that have supported me. Thanks for your patience and questions.